Hello everyone, good morning. My name is Shannon Moreno. Welcome to today's webinar, our latest episode in the larger ABCs of CLC webinar series. And today's topic is actually hot topics. Hopefully should be interesting, getting into some areas of conversation that may at times be a little bit controversial, so I'm a little bit in a hot seat this morning, but hopefully it'll be a good time for everybody. So you may be familiar with our ABCs of CLC webinar series. CLC again stands for Cultural and Linguistic Competence. We've done a number of episodes, and we kind of start out with the same few slides with just some foundational information about what the series is about, what today's specific webinar is going to be about. So if you're familiar with this, the first couple of minutes will look familiar to you, but it's important information to go over every time. So first of all, the purpose of this series and every episode within the series is to provide very basic foundational clarification on common terms that you may hear in different trainings regarding cultural and linguistic competence in order to assist participants in better understanding more thorough topical presentations. So typically in our webinars in the series, we don't necessarily get to the level of specific application. It's really more about making sure that there's a common language. Sometimes there can be misunderstandings about different terms and phrases, that we want to try to get everyone on the same page about what exactly it is we're talking about so that we're not talking past each other in some conversations that may be at times uncomfortable, or in regards to today's topic on hot topics, even to the level of being a little bit controversial sometimes. We provide other types of webinars and even face-to-face trainings that can be tailored for your specific group or organization. So this kind of clearing the air on different vocabulary or terminology can be very, very helpful to, again, make sure that we're all just kind of speaking the same language when we use different terms and phrases. We also have a few different uses for this information that we present. So first of all, one use is to either learn for the first time or review if certain terminology or phrases are familiar to you, current terminology. And I kind of, even though it's not underlined on the slide, hypothetically sort of underline that word current terminology. Language does change over time. I'm going to talk about that just a little bit more in a second. But again, at the end of the day, it's all about making sure that we can communicate with each other. Another big use for this series is to inspire deeper learning. This webinar series on a lot of different topics really just scratches the surface. It's not intended to be kind of a one and done, okay, now I completely understand all of the implications that go into making sure that my services or my organization as a whole are culturally and linguistically appropriate for all folks, for all communities. It's really a foundational starting point. And so we hope that folks come away from each webinar episode in this series encouraged to continue to learn more. Another potential use is in a very constructive way, not in a burdensome or a mean way, to potentially raise in yourself some red flags of current knowledge. Obviously, learning how to effectively work with various communities, that's an ongoing, lifelong learning. And so sometimes in these episodes, sometimes in this webinar series, it may highlight for you areas where maybe you do need to do some additional investigation and research. And we hope that that is displayed in an encouraging way for you. So before we start getting into it this morning, a disclaimer that I always give, and I kind of started to mention it on the previous slide, is that language does indeed change. And that's incredibly important to bring up and understand because this webinar series is all about terminology, making sure that folks are on the same page about what different words, what different phrases mean. But that is something that is going to change over time. That's just the nature of linguistics. Language changes, and then especially when we're talking about words or terminology in regards to cultural competence, where there's kind of an ever-flowing, change of specific community groups, perhaps being empowered to have a stronger voice than they have in the past. Sometimes language will change as far as how individuals want to identify or larger communities want to be referred to by other folks who are not a member of that community. That's something that I can sometimes hear from people is an area of frustration. It can feel like, oh, I just can't keep up with, what is today's, word, so to speak. And that's understandable to a certain degree, but again, we want to make sure that we're providing services, that we're interacting with folks in a way that is respectful and meaningful to them. So language changes over time. Also, the rate of responsiveness to that change is probably, it tends to vary from organization to organization. If we're talking about a group of grassroots community activists, that type of a group is going to be able to change what words they tend to use to reflect the desires of a community faster than a huge institution, a huge state institution, or a huge federal institution. So sometimes you may see a bit of a mismatch as far as terminology that is in current use by different entities. That's just kind of a reality. It's kind of a name of the game, so to speak. If we're talking about a larger entity that has a more bureaucratic process to change the way that they refer to different community groups, that's going to take longer. So these are just things to keep in mind as well. All right, so let's get into it. Our first hot topic today is something that you may or may not have heard of before, but it's a term called intersectionality, and this is kind of a framework for viewing how different folks can identify. So just temporarily with the image that you see on the PowerPoint here, I want you to ignore those red arrows for just a moment. I'm going to talk about those in a minute, but first I want to talk about the base image here, where you see a little stick person in the middle, and then around that person are all these different arrows of different pieces of their identity, including race, education, sexuality, ability, so on and so forth, that are different components that go into this person's identity. That's the image that I'm going to talk about and focus on for a minute. So intersectionality is actually a framework that was created by a civil rights activist and scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw. And Kimberly Crenshaw came up with this kind of framework and idea that I'm going to be explaining a little more thoroughly after she heard of a 1976 legal case in which a group of black women were suing a large employer for not hiring black women specifically because they were black women. So the situation that was going on with this legal case was there was a large company that was hiring African American men to do behind the scenes work, kind of more like labor, manufacturer type work. And this company was hiring white women to be in customer service roles or kind of secretarial type of positions. But the company was actively not hiring black women, and there was a pretty, hefty, case and evidence regarding this, that the company was specifically not hiring black women. The court, under Title VII, did not rule in favor of the group of women that were suing this company and did not hold up that this was a discriminatory practice, because the court said that the group of women had to either bring forward a case that discrimination was taking place on the basis of race or on the basis of gender or sex, as was the terminology used at the time. But to package these two pieces together was, as the judge in this case put it, getting two swings at the bat, so to speak, or in some way providing like double special treatment for this group of women, whereas in reality what was happening was double sources of discrimination. The court said because the company was hiring Black individuals, Black men, and because the company was hiring women, white women, that this group of Black women did not have a leg to stand on in regards to their case. Kimberly Crenshaw heard about this case, and there are a number of other cases as well that kind of inspired her thinking for this framework, and realized that there had to be a way of describing where it's not just a matter of you belong to one specific group or another, but there's an intersection between different areas of identity that create a different life experience for folks than they may experience otherwise if other things are different. So for example, in this case, the experience of this group of African American women was different than the experience of white women who were seeking employment at this company, as was their experience different than the experience of Black men seeking employment at this company. It's not just a matter of the racial and ethnic identity alone, the gender alone. It was putting these two pieces together that created this situation of unique discrimination. So the idea of intersectionality is in essence that your specific identity and where you kind of fit in society and the different barriers or the different opportunities that may be presented to you by larger society as a whole is about how all these different components of who you are come together. Now, the reason that this topic is in our Hot Topics webinar is sometimes when people hear about this framework or hear people talk about this framework, they have an opinion of that the judge in that court case that, oh, now you want quote unquote special treatment for this and special treatment for that, and you're just creating yourself or proposing that you're just like a victim left and right in society type of a thing. That's an attitude that sometimes folks may have in regards to this framework, this idea of intersectionality. But the reality is that folks who do have multiple areas of potential discrimination, when we look at research, when we look at data, individuals who fit that cross-sectional demographic do tend to have worse outcomes. And then folks who tend to have more areas where there aren't those societal barriers in place aren't necessarily guaranteed to be like rich and famous or anything like that, but tend to have better outcomes type of a thing. So this is an important framework to understand in working with youth and families. Now, I also want to talk about the red arrows here, which represent something that I've heard referred to as like marginalization within marginalization. And that is to say that there are some intersectional identities where, let's just take a young person, for example, that maybe we're working with. If they have a specific identity that doesn't quite fit the mold of any specific community group that they belong to, that's a very difficult situation for that young person that as service providers we need to be aware of and responsive to. So an example of this, let's say that a young person is a person of color, identifies as LGBTQ, and believes very strongly and is an important part of their life, their faith, and being involved with their faith community is very important to them, okay? That individual may face discrimination from the actual community groups that they belong to because of a certain piece of who they are in this very specific intersectional identity. So this person may, within their faith group, for example, face homophobia. But then this young person goes into LGBTQ spaces and interacts with their LGBTQ community, and maybe they face racism, or maybe they face a lot of disrespect and pushback in regards to what religion they belong to. Maybe within their racial ethnic group, they also face a lot of homophobia. And so in this type of a situation, you can see where for this young person, kind of regardless of where they go for human connection, for healthy, intimate relationships, I'm not talking about like romantic relationships per se, but you know, where you can have heart-to-heart talks with other people and develop deep friendships and just be yourself completely and totally without judgment and without, you know, fear for your safety as well. For a young person with an identity like that, there can be this marginalization within marginalization piece taking place. Now imagine that young person starting to have behavioral health concerns. Maybe they have behavioral health issues anyways, and then on top of that they have this lack of support, or maybe because of this lack of support and genuinely being able to be who they are within different areas of their life, that develops into, you know, issues of depression, suicidality, so on and so forth. It could develop into a lot of different things. Not having a lens as professionals working with youth with behavioral health concerns for the actual intersectional identity and how that can impact a young person's experience in larger society, as well as their experience moving amongst different groups that they belong to, different communities that they belong to, that's really missing a very, very big piece of understanding the day-to-day life of this young person and some reasons that potentially are contributing to the actual behavioral health issue, or if it's not that case, are at least certainly contributing to a lack of support in that young person's life. So when we're talking about professionals who are interacting with young people, understanding this intersectionality piece is incredibly important. The next hot topic I would like to talk about this morning is a word that can sometimes automatically just shut people down, which is why I want to delve into it a little bit deeper this morning. A lot of times when we say the word privilege, and first of all, there's a lot of different areas of privilege. Probably one of the bigger, more common areas of privilege that we hear talked about and tends to have a lot of defensiveness regarding is white privilege. But there's also ableism privilege, there is cisgender privilege, there's sexuality privilege. There's a lot of different forms of privilege that exist. A lot of times the word privilege, when people hear that, the image that comes into their head is kind of like the left picture on your screen of a baby being born with like literally a silver spoon in their mouth, and you see a little message, stockholder on his mother's side, and it just brings up ideas of folks who are just born on easy street. Their lives are easy, like trust fund babies type of a thing. And when you are a member of a group, that someone is saying as a group as a whole experiences privilege, but your personal life and the life of pretty much everyone that you know doesn't look like that, doesn't look like having everything handed to you on a silver plate. It's very understandable to get defensive and say, no, like, I'm not privileged, that's not my life. I've had to fight tooth and nail for everything that all of my parents and grandparents and so on and so forth have as well. Don't tell me I'm privileged because I happen to be XYZ. That's not true, okay? That is the idea, that's the kind of mindset that a lot of folks have when we say privilege. Again, this webinar series is all about trying to get us on the same page about vocabulary and what we mean when we say certain words and phrases. When privilege is brought up in the context of like social justice and equity issues, certainly in regards to if you attend some form of a cultural competence training of one form or another, this situation of your life being super easy no matter what because you are XYZ is not what the person is talking about at all. That's not the definition of privilege that's being used, okay? So I'm going to talk about well, what is the definition of privilege that's being used in these contexts of equity and social justice and so on and so forth? First of all, what is not being said is that if you experience privilege, it does not mean that your life is easy, has been easy, or will continue to be easy. Doesn't mean that. It also doesn't mean that you're safe from experiencing terrible things. You can have privilege, thinking back to the intersectionality I was talking about a bit ago, you can have privilege in areas of your life and still go through awful, awful things. It doesn't mean that you're automatically more successful than all people who don't have your form of privilege. So using the example of white privilege, it doesn't mean that all white people at the end of the day are going to end up being more successful than all people who are not white. Doesn't mean that. And it also does not mean if you experience some form of privilege or another that you're evil, that you're a terrible, evil person, and you are individually responsible for all the bad things that have happened to other folks who do not experience your form of privilege. None of that is what we're talking about in equity or cultural competence conversations when we talk about privilege. So what are we talking about? Some of you may be familiar with an exercise called the privilege walk, which is an image to the right of your screen. I've seen this exercise done well. I've seen it done very, very poorly. So if you have done it once or maybe even multiple times, I don't know for sure that whether that was a positive experience for you or not. Again, I've seen it done pretty poorly before. But the idea of this exercise in face-to-face trainings is to show how different, belonging to different groups or having different intersectional identities can lend itself to more opportunities or to more barriers in general when we're talking about very, very much in generalizations when we're talking about populations. So you can see the example on this image. If you can show affection for your romantic partner in public without fear of ridicule or violence, take one step forward. This idea of being able to, in public, hold your partner's hand or, give them a sweet little, publicly appropriate kiss or something like that, that's something that a lot of folks don't consider as a privilege. That it's considered just like normal. But it's not something that everyone has access to. Not everyone can hold their partner's hand or give them a, publicly appropriate kiss or, hold on to their shoulders or, all these different forms of physical touch and affection without fearing for their safety or fearing for at minimum ridicule or drawing undue attention that they don't want to have. That's something that if you are cisgender and straight is a privilege that you have. Now it doesn't feel like a privilege, like I said before, it feels normal, it feels like the default. But in reality, that's kind of what any form of privilege in the context of equity and social justice is the way it should be for everybody. Everyone should just be able to do these things and not have these barriers in place solely because of who they are, but the reality is that they do. So another way of thinking privilege is if you were to take 100 people and they all have led just really cruddy lives, just born into bad situations, have experienced really, really terrible things. None of them are the people like the baby on the screen, born with a silver spoon, born into having stocks and so on and so forth. We're not talking about that at all. But every one of these 100 people have had a fairly equal, difficult, cards handed to them, life circumstance, so on and so forth. If you add on top of that being a racial or ethnic minority versus being white, being a racial or ethnic minority on top of anything else that's going on creates additional barriers, creates additional issues and concerns that have to be dealt with from society. That's where there's white privilege, right? Again, it may not always necessarily feel like a privilege, because nobody should have to have extra barriers just because of what racial or ethnic group that they belong to. But that is what happens. Take this example of 100 people and have all things being exactly the same amongst these folks, but change one thing. And that's what we're talking about, where some folks experience privilege and other folks do not. And this throws back to what I was talking about a moment ago of intersectionality. You can have different pieces of your identity where you experience privilege and different pieces where you experience oppression and discrimination. So one really common kind of defense or pushback to this idea of privilege that I hear a lot, especially in regards to white privilege, is when white folks feel like, you know, I'm not privileged. I come from a low socioeconomic status background. I've had to fight for everything, so on and so forth. Really what you're saying when you're saying that is that you understand the framework of intersectionality. You understand that there are different pieces where you can have additional difficulties or barriers. Your socioeconomic status is an additional difficulty or barrier. However, your race, the fact that you are white, is not an additional difficulty or barrier. That's kind of what we're talking about, or that is essentially what we're talking about when we talk about privilege. I know that this is sometimes hard for some folks to kind of accept or to be on the same page about, because at the end of the day, that word, that phrasing of it, it still doesn't sit right. It still just feels like, yeah, but my life isn't easy. Like, I don't like this word. If for the sake of delving deeper into conversations and just being able to communicate to each other, when you hear this word in a social justice construct, if you want to just internally in your mind code switch it to something else that feels better, you know, if you hear privilege and you want to code switch it to not as cruddy a situation as what others have or something like that, then for the purpose of being able to go steps further into conversation and go deeper into examining different ways that we can make sure that we're providing services that are equitable and respectful to all persons, you know, go ahead and hang in there. But I have seen folks, as I said before, in deeper trainings just completely shut down because they don't like the sound of this word, the way that it's used. But hopefully it helps explain, even if you don't necessarily feel better about it, hopefully I've helped to explain what is and is not meant by this specific word. Okay, now we're going to take a look at institutionalisms, specifically interpersonal versus institutional. This is an idea, a concept that I've talked about in a few of our ABC of CLC webinars, all the way going back to our very first one, which was this versus that. But it's necessary to bring up again because institutional isms like racism, sexism, homophobia, which doesn't really fit like the ism pattern, but is another, you know, ism, so to speak. It can be really hard to understand, and if there's not that understanding, then we're going to be speaking past each other in our conversations. So the picture is actually not representing institutional isms, it's representing interpersonal or one-on-one isms. Interpersonal or one-on-one, you know, like I said, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, whatever the case may be, pretty much everyone is familiar with and understands, and hopefully we're on the same page about. This is the one-on-one interactions where you just don't think that someone is worthy of dignity and respect because of who they are. This can include racial slurs or slurs of other forms as well. These situations certainly take place still today, but generally speaking, you know, when I'm providing trainings for service providers, for professionals, everyone tends to be pretty much on the same page about like, no, this is bad, obviously. Like, don't do this. If a family of a specific cultural group is working with you or working with a worker, and that worker is explicitly being discriminatory type of a thing because of the cultural group the family belongs with, everyone tends to be pretty much on the same page that that's a bad thing. But this is not the only form of ism that takes place. Majority culture in the U.S. tends to be very individualistic and have a lens for the individual in pretty much every circumstance. And so it can be very, very hard to hear when we're talking about institutional issues. Oftentimes I'll see that folks flip back to the individual level. And that's where we start to talk past each other. So what I need to explain in more detail is an actual institutional ism. Institutional isms, again, like racism, sexism, so on and so forth, don't require for individual people to be discriminatory or prejudiced in order for the policies or procedures or system at large to be discriminatory and oppressive towards a group of people. Okay? So there are structural issues that are ingrained within an organization, entity, or system that, again, it's set up in such a way that results in discrimination, marginalization, oppression, where individual workers don't necessarily have to have that attitude or approach. They can be just, quote unquote, doing their job, but the result is a negative impact on a specific community or cultural group. That's to say that that law, policy, or procedure creates a process that is either meant in the first place to discriminate, or if that wasn't necessarily the intention, at the end of the day, what it does do is discriminate. What it does do is it creates a negative impact as opposed to a positive impact. So an example of this, which you can see displayed in this cartoon on the slide, is something called redlining, which I've given as an example for institutional isms in the past. But very, very quickly, just to go over this as an example, redlining was a lending and housing policy that forced people of color, specifically African American and Hispanic or Latino persons as well, to live in areas with really limited resources and limited opportunities. Maps were drawn with actual red lines to outline areas where persons of color were, quote unquote, allowed to live and keep areas that were really, really booming post-World War II for, with lots of resources, good schools, just good housing situations that were booming after World War II when the GIs came home, were left only for white folks to live in. This is, like I mentioned, very rampant during the time when GIs were coming home. So white GIs came home and were able to, tap into specific benefits and able to result in increased prosperity for their families, while Black and Hispanic or Latino GIs oftentimes came home and were not able to tap into many of the benefits of the GI Bill and were not able to experience that same level of increased prosperity for their families. This redlining policy did not require individual loan officers or other workers involved in carrying out the work to discriminate at an individual level. That might have been happening as well, and it probably was. But it didn't require that. The system was set up in place to be stacked against communities of color, to where loan officers and other workers involved could just, quote unquote, be doing their job according to the policies and procedures that were in place, and it resulted in disenfranchisement and huge discrimination against communities of color, the impact of which can still be seen today. This was a huge missed opportunity to have some equity after World War II going on with the GIs coming back home, it could have assisted a lot of families of color to experience a higher level of prosperity, similar to what happened in a lot of white families where GIs came home. But instead we had discriminatory practices in place. So that's an example of an institutionalism. So if we think about institutionalisms in regards to our systems that serve children and youth with behavioral health issues, as well as their families, we can think of an example of maybe a program that provides, bicycles as a transportation option to families. You may be familiar with some of the different imageries comparing the idea of equity and equality in our webinar episode on this versus that, which is available on our Texas System of Care website, as well as is searchable on YouTube. I explain in detail the difference between equity and equality. I'm not going to take the time to review that now, but this is a part of an equality imagery from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is basically talking about or displaying the imagery of providing cookie cutter, same services to every individual, regardless of the needs of that individual. So you can see in this image that's the third rider to the right. The bicycle seems to fit her well, and the bicycle does not seem to do as well serving the needs of the other three individuals in the picture. So how does this display institutionalism? Well, if we're talking about a worker in a program that is distributing bicycles to help with transportation issues, I think we're all on the same page that if we have a worker that folks come to for assistance and that worker is degrading and derogatory and yells and uses slurs and it does all these terrible things because they have prejudice against different groups of people, that worker should not be working there, right? Like they're not in the right line they're not in the right career field type of a thing. They shouldn't be serving youth and families. We're on the same page with that. That's talking about interpersonalism issues. However, I might have another worker who has a heart of gold, and they work really, really hard. They could have gone into another career field that pays better, but they didn't. They're definitely not in it for the money. They're still paying off loans. They're, making personal sacrifices, sacrificing family time to get these bikes out to folks. They have a heart of gold. They really, really work hard, and they also make sure that they're nice and personable and try to build rapport with absolutely every person that they interact with, regardless of whatever cultural group that person may belong to, okay? At the end of the day, the bikes that worker is hooking people up with and trying to provide assistance with is not meeting the needs of everyone, right? Like if in the picture these 4 people represent 4 different cultural groups within the local service area of this organization or of this bike program, 1 out of 4 communities is actually getting something that they can do something with. 3 out of 4, it falls short, right? 2 out of the 4, they can sort of make it work, but there's a lot of struggles. It's not really super great. And then 1 out of the 4 can't even use this bicycle at all because it's not meeting their needs. It's not meeting them where they're at, type of a thing. That is what folks are talking about when they're talking about institutional issues. So where I see this talking past each other thing play out a lot is there may be feedback from a specific cultural group or even an individual, an activist or an advocate saying this institution or this program or this law or this whatever it may be is racist, it's homophobic, it's sexist, it's whatever the case may be. people hear that and they go to the interpersonal level, not understanding the institutional level. So our bicycle program worker who has a heart of gold and works day in and day out to get people bicycles, when they hear from 3 out of 4 community groups, this program is racist, this program is whatever the case may be, what they're hearing sometimes I see happen is that that feedback from communities is being taken as you, individual worker, are X, Y, Z, and you're terrible and you're awful and so on and so forth. Whereas what people are actually talking about is an institutional issue where the program is not set up in a way that is beneficial either at all or is only partially sort of beneficial towards the community, and that's just kind of the way it is, and the program, the organization, the entity, whatever the case may be, is not taking that seriously and is not making strides to actually provide services or products or whatever in a way that is going to be beneficial for all of the communities. So this idea of institutionalism, I can't stress enough how important it is, because there are words that get thrown around and then there's responsive defensiveness because we're not all thinking or looking at things through an institutional lens. And oftentimes when it comes to issues and complaints, of course interpersonal concerns still exist today. I'm not saying that that's all solved and there's no problems any longer, but a lot of issues that exist in regards to not serving communities as a whole in a culturally and linguistic competent manner comes down to institutional problems. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement. I told you all it was going to be a hot topic within our. This is a very, very hot topic. So I am going to spend a minute here. I do have originally planned a couple of other things after this topic, but depending on time, we'll kind of see how it goes. We may end on this note, or there may be time to move on afterwards. But this is obviously a very hot topic, very controversial. I ask that you just kind of like hang in there with me with this. Hopefully the information that I provide is going to be helpful. I'm going to be weaving through some history of the movement, some Texas-specific information for context, reminders of some disclaimers that I gave in the beginning of today's webinar, and some explanation of what the movement is, as well as varying perspectives on the movement to a certain extent. I do want to say that I'm not going to give a super comprehensive overview of the movement, and I'm also not going to get into the nitty-gritties of certain, court cases or very specific instances or conversations about who's right or wrong in this particular issue or anything like that. The reason that the Black Lives Matter movement is one of the topics that I'm talking about today, I'm limiting it very, very much to the scope of trying to understand where folks who do align with the perspectives of the Black Lives Matter movement are coming from. Because this is something that, again, just like earlier I was saying with privilege, tends to really just automatically shut people down and we can't move on to further conversation and further understanding. This is also a similar one where obviously not absolutely everybody, but a lot of folks, when they hear Black Lives Matter, they immediately shut down. And there's no attempt to understand from the actual movement itself, from the founders, from members of the movement, from members of local chapters of Black Lives Matter, what these perspectives are, so only for the purpose of education and understanding. And I think it's something that's necessary to talk about. The point of talking about Black Lives Matter this morning is not to tell you what to think or what to feel. It's not. It is genuinely for the purpose of understanding a perspective of the movement. There's going to be moments when it seems like I'm straying a bit from talking specifically about Black Lives Matter, but this is such a huge topic, and again, one that we don't tend to have as much constructive conversations back and forth amongst misunderstandings, that it's going to take me a minute to get through. And even then, I'm sure that I'm not going to do it justice. If you have not checked out the Global Black Lives Matter website, information from a local chapter, if you have one in your area or sort of close to your area, interviews and founders, information from members themselves, so on and so forth, I really strongly urge you to do so and to add that, if you have not already, to your information on which you are basing your perspective on this movement. That will give you far better insight for the purpose of better understanding this perspective than what this white lady sitting in front of you can do. And yes, in the interest of cultural humility, it's important to point out, if it wasn't obvious already, that I'm not a member of the African American community. I am not the best person to do justice to explain the Black Lives Matter movement. Part of the point of this webinar series is to encourage continued learning, like I said before. So I hope what I present on this topic encourages you to learn more about the movement, again, if you haven't already. Again, from the actual founders and members of the community who feel firsthand the effects of the institutional issues that this movement is trying to address. And the movement really is about, by and large, institutional concerns. So a little background, which folks may or may not be familiar with. The Black Lives Matter Global Network was started in 2013 by Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. These three women have a long history of being community organizers in a variety of different issues, including but not limited to racial equity. So Alicia Garza made a Facebook post in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman after he killed Trayvon Martin, in which she stated in her Facebook post, Black people, I love you, I love us, our lives matter, Black lives matter. To which Patrisse Cullors, another founder of the movement, commented with hashtag Black Lives Matter. That was kind of the start of the movement. It wasn't at that time necessarily meant to grow into a movement. It was a response to a situation, but within a couple of days, Black Lives Matter became an actual movement, really. And today it has dozens of chapters with international influence as well. Now, at the time of this webinar, Black Lives Matter is celebrating 5 years of existence, and it has a variety of programs and initiatives under its umbrella, which if you go to the Global Black Lives Matter website, you can learn more about the specific programs that they have. Black Lives Matter, it's a different movement than maybe we've seen with some other racial equity movements, and in a couple of different ways. One is that it tends to be more kind of open and tailorable to community needs as opposed to being centralized. It's very, very decentralized. So what I mean by that is that, yes, a big part of Black Lives Matter is the vision of the three founders and the global network and those specific programs and initiatives, but very, very purposefully, there's not like a defined one-size-fits-all sort of framework or blueprint for local chapters to follow. It's almost in some ways kind of similar to like system of care, where there are some core principles, values, and characteristics, but it's left open for local communities to come to the table and determine how best the needs of young people with behavioral health concerns and their families can be met. Black Lives Matter is kind of similar in that way, where yes, there are some core values and characteristics, but it is kind of decentralized out, and local chapters are encouraged. The local African American community is encouraged to come together and organize in specific ways that are going to work for that specific community to try to undo institutional concerns in order to better the health and the wellness of the local African American community. Now, understanding Black Lives Matter and what it stands for is all about understanding very, very well the difference between the interpersonal and the institutional issues, like I was talking about a minute ago. Without a deep understanding of the structural or institutional issues that face the African American and larger Black community, it's very difficult to understand the perspectives of Black Lives Matter. If you go and you read materials or listen to interviews with a lens towards individual as opposed to institutional, you're not going to quite get what is being said, the messages that are being said. That is one big part of the divide on this movement and a lack of understanding across the board for this movement. A lot of folks who detest Black Lives Matter feel that the messages are about individual people, against individual, for example, white people, individual police officers, individual teachers, individual workers in a number of different areas, rather than structural policies and procedures that result in a negative impact for the Black community. So people may hear a message from the movement and say, you're anti-individual police officers, when really what folks in the movement are trying to say is, we're not against individual police officers. We're against policies and procedures that have weak accountability measures for when something goes wrong. And because of a lot of different factors, those structural issues tend to impact the African American community more, tend to impact the African American community in a more concentrated way than they might impact others. This can also include other things like discretionary school discipline that results in a more negative impact for Black children than it does for children who are not Black. Lots of different examples of structural and institutional issues. Again, it can feel like the messaging of Black Lives Matter, if you're not listening to it or reading it with a lens towards the institutional, it can feel like an attack on individuals. If you have a lens for how structural environments and policies impact communities, then even if those policies were not in place for the purpose of hurting that community, it's easier to understand what Black Lives Matter is about. Another reason it can be hard to understand what Black Lives Matter is trying to say is a misunderstanding between the ideas of intention and impact. Sometimes within institutions, the creation of laws, the creation of policies, the creation of procedures, they were not created with the intention of causing harm to the African American community. But if at the end of the day that's what's happening, then that law, policy, procedure, whatever the case may be that we're talking about, the way that it is enacted or even its very existence should be examined, right? Like, if we genuinely feel that the African American community is an integral and important part of our larger society as a whole, and there are certain institutional issues that are causing harm within this community, then first of all, that should matter. And second of all, that is really hurting the larger society as well, because not all of our communities are as strong as they could be. And if there are institutional issues that are at a concentrated level harming the African American community more than others, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not causing any harm elsewhere. So these are things that if we have a mindset for the collectivistic, we have a mindset for societal good as a whole, we can understand the importance of pointing out these issues. Another reason that I want to touch on for why some folks really have a distaste for Black Lives Matter is actually the name itself. Folks may feel that it has certain implications that the founders and members of the movement don't mean at all when they say Black Lives Matter, from which, of course, other counter names have come up, for example, All Lives Matter and other things like that. I do want to say for a moment that it is meant more as an idea of, like I was talking about a moment before, the Black community is a part of our larger society, and stating Black Lives Matter is in a way saying, hello, we're here too, like we matter too. Consider us, invite us to the table when decisions are being made, understand what life is like for us, and take us seriously when we say something going on in society is hurting our community. That is what is intended. Now, telling you what opinion to have or not have regarding the name Black Lives Matter, that's outside of the scope of my specific position and outside the scope of this webinar. I'm not going to tell you what feelings or opinions to have about the sound of a name or a term or anything like that. Just earlier in this webinar, I said, for example, privilege. If that's still the sound of it, the ring of it doesn't quite sound right to you, I'm not going to tell you you have to like a word. I'm not going to tell you that you have to like the name Black Lives Matter or feel a certain way about that. That is your opinion. Who am I to try to change that? But I hope that you can be open to understanding the reasons for the name and what exactly it is that folks who are part of this movement or aligned with this movement feel and believe in this perspective that not necessarily every single African American individual is going to be aligned with this movement, but it is a very, very common perspective, okay? If you are at a place where just even hearing Black Lives Matter just like shuts you down and you're not willing to reach that deeper level of understanding, at least from an empathetic point of view, then I would really, really challenge you with all due respect to try to move past that emotional response and open up to hearing what this perspective is. Because the African American community is a part of our society. It is a part of our population in Texas. It is a population that unfortunately is disproportionately represented within our systems. We have a disproportionate number of African American youth represented in our criminal justice system, child welfare system, who receive discretionary school discipline practices leading towards that school to prison pipeline issue, and that's a reality. And even though, again, Black Lives Matter, you can never say that 100% of people in a specific group are going to feel a certain way or have a certain opinion. So not every African American individual is going to align with the perspective of Black Lives Matter, but it is a very, very common perspective, especially in regards to youth who we're serving. And so what exactly is that perspective that I'm talking about? Well, first of all, in order to understand the position, we have to realize that the perspective from Black Lives Matter is indeed that institutional issues exist for the African American community that negatively impact that community. We have to understand that the position of the Black Lives Matter movement is that the African American community, is an important part of larger society, and hopefully we can all agree to that. I'm hoping we can agree to that, and that if there are issues and concerns that are concentrated or more highly impacting the African American community than it is others, that's deserving of time and investigation, even if it's not an issue that is always felt amongst all populations. And Black Lives Matter also encourages folks from all different groups to come together and work towards overcoming these institutional concerns that are impacting the African American community. Currently, the Black community is not always taken into account when considering the impact of various structures like laws, policies, and procedures. Black Lives Matter is a movement that says the African American voices matter. There needs to be more representation. In situations where there's not representation, there needs to be listening to the local community voice. And finally, Black Lives Matter wants to draw attention to laws, policies, and procedures that have a negative impact so that those impacts can stop, both for the local Black community as well as larger society as a whole. So those are the perspectives that, again, and I know I've said this a few times, but I want to reiterate it again, please look into this movement on your own. Do your homework if you haven't already. If your perspective on what this movement is about is coming from news headlines, conversations with folks who are not members of the African American community, and other sources of information that aren't actually from the movement itself, then I would really, really recommend that you add to that, to the perspective that you may have, information from the actual movement. And again, the reason that this is included in this webinar is because it's a common perspective within the African American community, and the African American community is one that we serve, and that should be important and should matter, just as all other populations matter as well. And so if there are specific issues or concerns, specific institutional barriers, then continue to have conversations about that is necessary. Okay, well, we have run out of time, and I apologize, I actually went over a little bit. I did have a couple other things I was going to go over, but in the interest of being thorough for the topics that I did bring up, I wanted to go over those. So I am going to display on here, if you have any questions, please contact us. Also, if you just want to connect with me, have some ongoing conversation about different topics, if you have different training needs that you would like to talk about, or anything in general, reach out about, that email is where you can reach us.